All right, welcome back to U.S. history. Today we're going to talk about some domestic conflicts going on during the Roaring Twenties. We're going to do a bit of a rehash on Nativism, the civil rights movement of the era, and Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy, which is more of a return to business as usual than normalcy. You might notice I'm a different spot. This is the this is the blank wall in my house. I had to record this in one home today. Normally I'll be back in the school studio. So, Nativism is a big one. We've talked about it before, a couple of units ago, but it definitely makes a big sort of return here, in a lot of ways a backlash. So, you have these new European immigrants that we talked about from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. These are two examples, Greece and Albania. You have Catholics, you have Eastern Orthodox, where the majority of Americans at this time are Protestant Americans. That's your Presbyterians, your Methodists, your Lutherans, and the sort of smaller groups that are still Protestant groups in America, like the Quakers, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. Right? So, just a super quick reminder: all of those groups, as well as Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, are all Christian religions. They just have different views on Christianity and who's in charge and who's not in charge, usually centered around the question of the Pope. Catholics, Pope, yes. Protestants, Pope, no. But other than that, you're based at Christianity. And again, anytime we want to talk religion, I'm not your spiritual advisor, I'm not telling you who's right and who's wrong, but this has the religion of the new immigrants have an effect on how they treat each other and how they're treated by people in their new home, and that's history. So we're going to talk about that. And some of them are even like communists and anarchists, which are these just fringe political beliefs at the time, and that's making Americans even more nervous. I don't think either of these two were communists or anarchists, but you never know. They look like all the rest of us. So we have anti-immigration laws. 1917, we have the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. This is after the Chinese Exclusion Act, which focused on China. This one kind of does the rest of Asia. And again, there's that sort of old-fashioned word Asiatic. Like, it's not a racist word, but it's not really a word we use these days. So, like, it's the name of a law, so we'll say it in history class, but, like, don't call people that. Then you have 1921, the Emergency Quota Act. This one targets Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Now this picture's from a little bit later on in history. As you can see, services for T-Day. This picture's from like late 1940s. Probably not the 1950s. Yeah, it's probably from late 1940s. But these are the people. These Jewish immigrants, just Jewish people in general in America. There's a real problem with anti-Semitism in America in the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Anyway, you get the point. Sort of a strange thing, in the 1920s and the 1930s, before the rise of Nazis and Nazism in Germany, Berlin was one of the better places to be, like, Jewish in Europe. Berlin was a very cosmopolitan city, very open and accepting of a lot of people that weren't really very well accepted elsewhere in Europe and America. So we think of the Nazis and how terrible Germany was to the Jewish people. But even then, there were places in Germany before the rise of the Nazis that Jewish people were maybe not perfectly equal and welcomed by everybody, but better than a lot of other places around the world. And that was true for a lot of other groups in Berlin at the time, and we'll get to that when we get to Berlin. And then a few years later, we have the Immigration Act of 1924, which the target on that one is Eastern and Southern Europeans, those Greeks, those Albanians, those Italians, Bulgarians, Romanians, etc. Right? Like it'd take a while to get all the groups that it targeted. Now the good news is you don't necessarily need to know exactly which law targeted exactly which people. I mean, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, like that one's what it sounds like. The other two, we're talking Eastern and Southern immigrants. The Emergency Quota Act specifically targeting Jewish people from those areas, which is kind of understand that like during this time period, that whole progressive era we were talking about, there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment for a few different reasons. Jobs, they're different than us, etc. So what do you think happens next? What does immigration look like after these laws? So we'll be kind of getting onto that answer as we go, but like kind of pause the video, take a minute, kind of think like, all right, no more Asian immigrants, or very limited number of people from Eastern and Southern Europe. So where are the immigrants going to come from? Are immigrants going to come? What's that going to look like? So take a moment, think about that. In class, we'll actually do the Pear Deck thing. So Attorney General Palmer was, the top cop of the land. Our current Attorney General, William Barr. Sorry, our current Attorney General is William Barr. The person running for Vice President, Kamala Harris. Senator Kamala Harris is the highest office she's attained, so that's her official title in America. She was the Attorney General of California, so this is a very political office, Attorney General. It's about law enforcement a lot, but there are certainly political ambitions that come from the Attorney General's offices of both the states and the federal government. Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, was Attorney General before he was assassinated while he was running for president. We'll get to that. It was after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, so and we'll get to that too, just not this unit. So Attorney General Palmer, he's the top cop. He's the guy that does the FBI and the law enforcement, and he kind of, I don't know if anyway, he deals with all the national law enforcement. And he's a nativist. He thinks that most of these new immigrants here are troublemakers and just, they're not here to be Americans, they're here to mess things up. And the two groups that catch his ire, the two groups that he really doesn't like, are communists and anarchists. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go on about these two groups. Anarchists definitely during this unit. Communism we'll talk a lot more about during the Cold War after World War II. But there was a Red Scare during this time period too. Communism is associated with the color red. So, the Red Scare is communists. And you can see him here in Uncle Sam here in the political cartoon, keeping them on the end of a hockey stick, almost like hooking him, grabbing people up. So he and his federal law enforcement officers conducted these raids. They would basically kick in the door. They would arrest a bunch of people, over 10,000 that we know of. I mean, records are kind of spotty from that area. Most of these guys that are arrested and rounded up for this are from Italy or from Eastern Europe. Remember the Italy connection. That's going to come into play in a minute. Remember that Italy connection? Sacco and Vanzetti. These are two Italian immigrants. Those are their actual mugshots for while they were in jail, or when they just got to jail. Yeah. And they were political anarchists. Now, real quick, capital A political anarchy is not nobody's in charge. Anyone can do whatever they want. It's an excuse for me to just go and punch people I don't like. Like, that's not political anarchism. Political anarchism is about trying to construct a society without, hierarchies. Now, you might be of the opinion that that's probably not going to work, and that's totally a fair political opinion. But I just want to kind of separate, right? These guys aren't just like, we're going to kill the government and put nothing in its place. Like, there is a long tradition of anarchist philosophy in the world. Again, I'm not saying that to say that's your political... I'm not your spiritual advisor, I'm not your political advisor. I want you to know about these political things and philosophies. I'm not advocating for or against any of them. except Nazism. I will 100% argue against Nazism. So they get arrested in 1920 by these, in these Palmer raids, Attorney General Palmer. And they got arrested for murdering 2 shop employees during an armed robbery. And so they get arrested, they get picked up very quickly, they get thrown into prison, mugshots, they get sent to trial very quickly. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence that they robbed the store, that they were anywhere near the store, that they owned the guns that were used. They did own guns, but there's not a ton of evidence that they owned the guns that were used in the robbery. So there's very little connecting them to what's going on with this murder, with this robbery. But they are convicted of the crimes and sentenced to death. They are both executed in 1927. They're on death row for about 6 or 7 years before they're executed. So the question here is, why? Why were they arrested? Oh, typo, should say arrested. Why were they arrested in the first place? Why did they get arrested? Why did the Palmer guys go and arrest them? And why did they get found guilty with a Y? Jeez Louise. Okay, I need to fix. I wonder if I'd messed that up or if autocorrect went in. That was me. I gotta take responsibility for that one. I messed those 2 up. Why were they found guilty with so little evidence? Anti-Italian discrimination, anti-European, Eastern Southern European discrimination, anti-anarchist discrimination. And this is kind of a useful time to remind you guys, during this time period, Italians weren't considered white. They weren't the right kind of Europeans. Today in America, we consider Italians white. Absolutely. If you know someone who's got Italian ancestry, don't run up and tell them oh, did you know you're not white? Because in 2020, we consider Italians to be white. And that's in large part due to Christopher Columbus, actually. A bunch of Italian Americans were tired of getting discriminated against, and they searched for some Italian heroes with connections to America. They found the story of Christopher Columbus, which was not very well known back then, and made a big deal to get holidays honoring him and get him in the textbooks, and honestly, it worked. And then historians kept digging into it and were like, oh, this dude's terrible. So, it's a whole thing. If you've seen the show The Sopranos, there's that episode or 2 where they're trying to do the Christopher Columbus Day Parade and the Native Americans are there protesting, and then they get into a fight with the Native Americans. Anyway, that's not even on the test. But just remember, Italians and Greeks and other Eastern Europeans, Romanians, Bulgarians, Albanians, etc., not considered white. Their skin looks a lot like this, but they weren't considered white. Because who's white and who's not is malleable, it's flexible, it's fluid. So we'll get more into that as we go. And another sort of conflict here in the domestic realm is the traditional morals versus sort of this new modern way of thinking. And there's a few things that sort of drive this, the new jazz music. I mean, you have these young, pretty well-off, well-to-do, even middle-class white kids running off to these speakeasies to listen to black people play jazz music, and it's oh my gosh, so that's one thing, and we'll get to that when we talk about the Jazz Age. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance. That's gonna be some cool notes. There's gonna be some good art, good music, good writing. That's a pretty fun one to cover, honestly. But this one here we're going to talk about is the Scopes monkey trial. Now in Kansas, I think this was in Kansas. It was in Oklahoma. One of the two. I think it was Kansas. A biology teacher, John Scopes, was arrested for teaching evolution to high school students in science class, 1925. My grandmother was 7 years old when this happened. So, we are very close. I know this is 100 years back, but we are very close to modern day America here. Now, John Scopes gets arrested on purpose, right? The state law says you can't teach evolution in science class. you have to teach the story of biblical creation, which, again, I'm not anyone's religious advisor. I'm not here to tell you what religion's right or wrong and what you should or shouldn't believe, but like maybe in school, like a public school, like a secular school, like a non-religious school, maybe in science class we should teach the scientific theories based on scientific evidence that we have. And folks that want to delve into sort of a religious faith kind of thing can do that in religious schools, in churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, etc. There's all kinds of places to do that. Just maybe not the teacher telling students facts, right? Maybe we could not do that. So he gets arrested on purpose. It's against the law, but like nobody's really getting arrested for it. People are doing it. It's just kind of a thing that's like, well, it happens. It's technically against the law, but what are you going to do? And there were big name people that were wanting to sort of blow this wide open and get rid of this law and challenge it. And so they talked to a bunch of science teachers, and they were like, are you willing to get arrested and go to trial for this and try and stand up for science and scientific thought? And a bunch of people said no. John Scopes said yes. And so he gets arrested, and there's a big trial. This is national news. People are coming from all over the country to watch this trial. Newspapers across the country are covering this trial every single day, what witnesses are called, what they say, the arguments they make. And an old friend of ours, William Jennings Bryan, told you he's going to pop up in very, very unexpected places in your history book. He is a lawyer for the state. He is a lawyer saying that we should be teaching the biblical creation story in science class and not evolution. As much as I like William Jennings Bryan and his speech, amazing speech giver, just an amazing speaker, William Jennings Bryan. His writing style, his speaking style is phenomenal. I'm going to disagree with him on this one here. Personally, again, nothing wrong with all the any of the sort of religious creation stories of the world. I have no idea if any of them were right or not. I wasn't there. There's nothing wrong with any of those stories, but like teaching one of them, one religion's story as fact in a science class, And a very famous lawyer at the time period, Clarence Darrow, he is the one who represents Scopes. He's one of the ones who wants to get this law taken care of off the books and sort of allow science to be taught in science classrooms. There's a whole team. There's a whole team on both sides, honestly, but these are the two that kind of like brawl it out. Like these two are giving speeches to the jury and the judge every day. It's like I said, the media's going nuts over this thing. This is kind of called the trial of the century. And we give that name to a lot of things. But the last big one was the O.J. Simpson trial when I was a kid. But yeah, this was definitely trial of a century type. And John Scopes loses. The law is upheld. It is legal in the state to teach the story of creation and outlaw evolution. Now he has to. He's only. I think he's maybe like a $25 fine, and he's sentenced to time served, which means that the time he was in jail while he was awaiting while he was in trial, they just counted that as his punishment. So he didn't have to go to jail for it. It was a very small fine, but it's sort of cemented, in sort of a old school traditional sort of thing versus the new modern thing. This was definitely a victory for the traditional. Now, obviously that doesn't stand until 2020. In 2020 we teach evolution in biology class because that's the best that's the best information we have based on the evidence we've seen, scientific method. And some churches have actually come around on that too. There's a lot of Christian churches, including the Roman Catholic Church, that believe that, the evidence of evolution, but they just believe, God guided the process. Which, is that true? I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm not your spiritual advisor. But there are there's still plenty of Christian churches, especially in America, that are against evolution and don't believe in it and believe more of a literal biblical creation story. But a lot of Christian churches these days, they kind of take that into effect, and they, there's a lot of things. If you're interested in that, there are a ton of people online and offline that have way more experience, are actual biblical scholars, unlike me, that could really get into the whys and hows of those beliefs on either side of that issue. So speaking of issues, civil rights. Segue. We've talked about them before, but they keep coming up for a reason. These two were giants of the time period. And we talked about some of the other ones from this time period too, I.W. Wells being a big one. But these two were sort of the giants. This was the Malcolm X and the Martin Luther King Jr. of their time period. Booker T. Washington, he was the older of the two. He was kind of the elder statesman. He opened up the Tuskegee Institute in 1882. This is their, I think, 1915 class? Yeah. This is their 1915 class photo. Obviously, this is a growing university. All of these folks are graduating with some degree or another from the Tuskegee Institute. And if you remember, Booker T. Washington, his whole thing is we should go slow and steady. We should educate ourselves. We should improve ourselves. And eventually, once we have done enough work to prove that we are intellectually equal and physically equal and spiritually and morally and all the rest of the things that Booker T. Washington was concerned with, once black people had proven to white people that they could sort of like do anything white people could, then they'd have to give them equality. And trying to push for things too quick would just end up with a backlash. If you ever played with any of those non-Newtonian fluids in science class, what's that? Oobleck, I think, is like a name for it. And like if you just sort of like, sort of dip your hand down into it, it's just a liquid, right? But if you like punch down into it, it hardens underneath the impact and it sort of catches your fist. So the harder you hit it, the more it pushes back. Physics, right? And so Booker T. Washington was thinking, like, if we just sort of slow and steady over time get this done, then we will get there. And if that sounds a little bit like, a little bit, but not entirely like Martin Luther King Jr., yeah. Martin Luther King Jr. Certainly took a lot of inspiration from Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois, as we've talked about before, he wanted equality now. Obviously these two men had a lot of respect for each other. They just disagreed on this one major aspect of the civil rights movement. But if you read Du Bois' writings and you listen to what little audio and video we have of him, he died in like 1960s. I think he actually lived longer. I think he was still alive when Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were both assassinated. I think he lived to see that happen. Washington didn't live that long. But yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. took a lot of inspiration from W.E.B. Du Bois. And Malcolm X, a little bit from Washington, but he definitely was much, much, much more on Du Bois' side. And we'll get into that when we get to King and Malcolm. But knowing what you know about Malcolm X already, why do you think he identified a lot more with W.E.B. Du Bois, much more so than he identified with Booker T. Washington? So if you know about Malcolm X, you've probably got a good idea. If you don't yet, that's okay. We'll get to him. Not like today, but like eventually. And around this time period, a big part of the civil rights era of this time period is the Great Migration. Now, there's a big demand for jobs in the North. There's all kinds of factories, right? Rapid industrialization, a bunch of factories opening up, a ton of people moving to the cities. Like we've talked about all this in previous units. Well, eventually, the demand for workers gets so high that all of the people being born into the cities that are capable of having these jobs have these jobs. All of the immigrants that are being allowed in, remember, we've sort of limited the amount of immigrants from certain areas of the world that are coming into our country. Once they have been, a lot of them have been gotten jobs. Now there's even more factory jobs to be had. So here's a bunch of black sharecroppers living under the beginnings of Jim Crow, wanting out. They want to try their hand in the North. They want to head up north where hopefully it'll be better. And it's a great idea, and there was definitely work available. And so this sign's from Detroit. We want white tenants in our white community. And that's one of the more polite ones that I was able to find. A lot of them featured, obviously, the N-word. But you can kind of go looking for stuff like that if you'd like. And they didn't want any black residents in Detroit. Now, obviously, Detroit, Michigan is one of the... there's a pretty high percentage of African Americans that live in the city. So they expected less racism in the North, but really it was just different, and there were, the KKK was still around, they, it's not like they only existed in the South, they existed all over the country. And a bunch moved out west to California as well, a lot fewer into Oregon and Washington, because the KKK was really strong up there in the Pacific Northwest. Which maybe we'll get a chance to talk about. Maybe we won't. But, yeah, a bunch move out to California, a bunch move up to the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, at least a few. Milwaukee, one of the most segregated cities in the country in 2020. Legally you're not allowed to segregate based on housing. But Milwaukee sure seems to stay segregated even to this year, so it might not be legal to do stuff like that, but gosh. And as we've talked about before, the Red Summer of 1919, 1920, the race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street in 1921, and you might be looking at the civil rights movement, the stuff we talked about with Ida B. Wells, the stuff we talked about with Booker T. Washington, the stuff we talked about with W.B. Du Bois. You might have thought, why don't we hear about that in the same way we hear about the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s? 60s and 70s, you got the Civil Rights Act, you got Voting Rights Act, you got all kinds of things, desegregation of the schools, all kinds of things that go right for the civil rights era of the 1960s and 70s. And understand that none of those were won without a cost. Just the violent backlash, even to the peaceful protesting of Martin Luther King Jr., we will get to when we talk about the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s. But if you're wondering why all those successes came out of the 60s and 70s, but not a ton of successes out of the 1910s and the 1920s civil rights movement, is because this is how it ended up for a lot of the civil rights movement in the 1910s and 1920s. The Red Summer, we talked about how it went down in Chicago. At least 35 cities around the country over the next year have these very same race riots, minimum. And it sort of culminates with the burning of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where at least 300 were killed, potentially over 1,000. And yeah, this is why I'm gonna sort of break my normal rule of not advocating for or against any kind of political philosophy. But this is why I'm not going to stand for white supremacy or Nazism, because even if you were to take a majority of sort of the modern white supremacy movement in the U.S., they'd say, we don't necessarily hate them, we certainly don't want to kill them, we just want, a black area and a white area. We want our race, whatever that means. we want our race to have a separate spot, and we want the black people in their own spot, and Hispanic people in their own spot. And it's like, well, where do you draw lines, first off? But this is what the people of Greenwood did. They built their own community. They couldn't go to the white movie theaters. They couldn't go to the white schools. They couldn't go to the white doctor's offices or the white restaurants. So they built their own. And they made money doing it. This community was successful. And then it was burned to the ground, and they were all murdered, and all their stuff was stolen. You know, a lot of, you know, some of the footage, the very limited footage we have, you know, there's white people running out of these houses, these really nice houses in Greenwood, with whatever furniture and clothing they could carry, because it was nice furniture and nice clothing, nicer than a lot of the white families that were committing this violence. And yeah, that's an airplane in the picture. Official reports are that it was only for reconnaissance, you know, to find where the black people were hiding from the mob. But there's a lot of reports that they were throwing bombs out and shooting guns out from it. So, I don't know. I don't know. So why do you think the Red Summer and the Tulsa Race Massacre aren't in most high school U.S. history textbooks in the modern day? They certainly weren't in the history books when I was in high school, and I wasn't in high school all that long ago. It wasn't that long ago that I was in high school. Not mentioned a single time in my high school education. And I was in the honors history classes. AP. Not mentioned, not brought up. Thankfully, that seems to be changing. All right. The return to normalcy. Normalcy, as Warren G. Harding would pronounce it. I don't know if most of you remember the presidency of George W. Bush, but he was very well known for messing up pronunciations on things. And Warren G. Harding had a similar sort of reputation. So the return to normalcy. Warren G. Harding is elected. Decades we have these progressive politics. We have Teddy Roosevelt. We have William Howard Taft. We have, you know, the dollar diplomacy of Taft. Even Woodrow Wilson, you know, a Democrat at the time, he had his own progressive ways of doing things. Incredibly racist. Helped the Ku Klux Klan be resurrected in America because he thought they were an important American institution protecting American traditions, like killing black people because they're black. Anyway, whatever. Woodrow Wilson spent the last year-ish of his presidency in bed because he had a stroke and his wife covered for him. So we haven't had a technical female president yet, but no, we haven't technically had a woman as president yet. But Woodrow Wilson's wife has a very good argument to be made that, you know, she was actually the president during that time period. And there's a less obvious argument to be made for Ronald Reagan's wife, because he definitely eventually got Alzheimer's, but there's certainly a historical argument has been made. And it's an argument, both for and against. There's evidence on both sides of this. You'd have to do a lot of your own reading to get it, but that he had Alzheimer's the last 2 years-ish of his term, and that it was mostly his wife making decisions. Anyway, Warren G. Harding, his wife doesn't get to be president. So the Republican Party is like, okay, we've had all these crazy progressive experiments, and what has that gotten us? Got us involved in World War I. It's got the stock market going crazy because, you know, all these different workers' protections, all these government regulations, all these new things happening. Tell you what, let's slow down. Let's have a nice return to normalcy. No more economic experiments. No more new regulations. No more trust busting like Teddy Roosevelt was fond of doing. We're going to let America get back to business as usual, a return to normalcy. Now, the Republican Party, they have to figure out who can we pick to do this? Who can we trust to do this? And at the Republican National Convention in Chicago that year, it was actually held at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, they made a bunch of backroom deals in this smoke-filled back room in the Blackstone. And they advertised it. Like, if you go to the Blackstone today, you can like go in and be like, hey, can you show me the smoke-filled back room where they picked Warren G. Harding as president? They'll be like, right this way. They're very proud that happened there. I actually got to go, not last time I was in Chicago, but at some point I got to stay there for the night. It was a nice hotel. And so in this back room, they're smoking their cigars and they're saying, well, which candidate would be popular but easy to control? And the name that went around with those two criteria, very popular, could be elected, easy to control, isn't going to go off and do his own stuff. He's going to do what we want him to do. The leadership of the Republican Party at the time wanted him to do. And the name that went out resoundingly was Warren G. Harding. And so they send sort of a messenger up to his room, and he knocks on the door, and it's late at night, very late at night, but Harding's awake, and he comes to the door, and the guy says, okay, they want you, but first we have to know, are there any scandals? Is there anything that could come out? Is there anything that could mess this up for us? And Harding kind of thinks about it and goes, nope, everything's fine. And so the guy runs back down, the decision is made, Warren G. Harding wins the presidency. Now there's a really good chance that the reason Warren G. Harding was awake in the hotel room when the messenger ran up is that he was with somebody who wasn't his wife. So when the guy asked him, hey, there's no scandals or anything, there's kind of a scandal happening at the moment. We don't know that for sure, but there's decent evidence that that's the kind of guy Harding was. Much more interested in playing poker with the boys than being president. He had a weekly or sometimes as often as nightly poker game with his cabinet, which were mostly his buddies from college, the Ohio gang. So his cabinet's just his old friends from college, man. So they'd kind of do some government, and then they'd go play some poker and smoke some cigars and drink some alcohol and just have a nice night. And pretty much immediately the corruption begins. These cabinet members are embezzling money. They're grifting off money. They're getting money for their friends, for their family. More than one member of the cabinet ends up convicted. One commits suicide because of all the crimes that he did that he was going to go to jail for. Now, the most famous, and the one that's 99% sure this slide here is going to show up on the STAR test. Albert Fall, Secretary of the Interior. This is the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, the Teapot Dome is that bit of rock in Wyoming? I think it's in Wyoming. Might be in Wyoming. The Teapot Dome. From a certain angle, it kind of looks like a teapot, I guess. You can kind of see the spout over there on the right-hand side. Kind of. Anyway, that's the Teapot Dome, and that was federal land, and it was actually a big oil field that, they discovered oil in it, the U.S. had bought up the land, and they were using that as a backup plan. What if we can't buy oil from other countries anymore, and we need oil for our Navy? Remember our Navy? Kind of an important part of the American whole, defense system, our Navy. So if other countries won't sell us oil, and we only have so much that we can buy from private industry, we need a secure stockpile. And that, there were more than, we had more oil fields than just this one, but this was a big one. And Albert Fall sold the land in return for bribes. Super obviously corrupt. Super obviously this dude is breaking laws and committing crimes. And eventually it's found out. But luckily for Warren G. Harding, it's found out after he dies of a heart attack. Well, that might not be lucky for Warren G. Harding, because he died of a heart attack. Probably. I don't know why, but every time I see in a history book, like, oh, Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack, there's always like a probably. Like, we don't know for sure. We're pretty sure, but we don't know for sure. Probably died of a heart attack, though. And this is a huge, huge, huge scandal. So the question I want you guys to think about is, did the voters get what they wanted when they voted for this return to normalcy? Harding's return to normalcy. Then we have Calvin Coolidge, and I couldn't think of a better way to tell you about Calvin Coolidge than to let the man explain it for himself. He's the next president after Warren G. Harding. This is a quote from one of his speeches, maybe his inaugural address. Anyway, one of his speeches. He doesn't give a lot of speeches. Coolidge doesn't talk a lot. His nickname's like Cool Cal, because he doesn't talk much. He only talks when he needs to. You know, like me. Sorry. So Calvin Coolidge, this is a quote from one of his speeches. After all, the chief business of the American people is business. They are profoundly concerned with producing, buying, selling, investing, and prospering in the world. De Tocqueville hit us with this in decades before Calvin Coolidge made this speech, right? Very familiar with these words, de Tocqueville. I am strongly of the opinion that the great majority of people will always find these are the moving impulses of our life. But it is only those who do not understand our people who believe that our national life is entirely absorbed by material motives. So he's saying that, yes, we are very much motivated by money, by buying things, selling things, etc. But it's not greed. We make no concealment of the fact that we want wealth, but there are many other things that we want much more. We want peace and honor, and that charity, which is so strong an element of all civilization. The chief ideal of the American people is idealism. So the chief business of the American people is business, and the chief ideal of the American people is idealism. Again, I'm not your political advisor. But what do you think? You think this guy gets it? 1 to 10. In class, we'll do the actual Pear Deck, obviously. But kind of think to yourself, 1 to 10. 1, he has no idea what he's talking about. This dude does not understand Americans at all. A 10, he's got us. This dude knows exactly what Americans are all about. Super quick story about Calvin Coolidge, my favorite one. Remember, he's Cool Cal. He doesn't speak a lot unless he needs to. He's at some fancy dinner as part of being president. I don't know if it was a fundraiser or some state event. And he's seated next to this woman. Because there's a seating chart and everything. He's seated next to this woman. And the woman, she knew ahead of time because of the seating chart that she'd be sitting next to the president. And so when she sits down, she looks over to him and says, "Oh, President Coolidge, I've made a bet with my husband that I can get you to say at least 3 words at the table tonight." And he looks at her and he says, "You lose." And he didn't talk the rest of the night. Go Calvin Coolidge. Cool Cal. So what? So what about all of this? Why did nativism and this push for civil rights in this era matter? Well, how does this connect to our life today, right? Nativism and racism are generally seen as side by side in American history. Now you might say, well, these guys were prejudiced against Italians and the Irish and Albanians. Those are all white. That's not racism. Remember, though, 2020, Irish people, Italians, and Albanians, they're white. In 1920, they're not. So nativism and racism are very closely interlinked. There's technical differences here and there, but they're very much driven by the same fears and the same prejudices. So the anti-immigration laws in the 1920s that we talked about, the anti-Asian one, the anti-Jewish one, the anti-Eastern and Southern European one. There's more coming. We're going to get to more and more and more anti-immigration laws through the Great Depression, especially through the Great Depression. After World War II, this is not an opinion, this is a fact. You can go look it up, or I'll be happy to send you some sources on this. It is far easier for former Nazis to sort of put away their uniforms and hide the fact that they were Nazis and move to America and become American citizens, after World War II, after we discovered about the Holocaust, after American soldiers freed the death camps. We let a bunch of former Nazis in, and we basically knew who they were. We knew. They might have had some forged paperwork, but it was kind of a wink and a nudge, we knew. And it was still very difficult for Jewish families to make it into this country at that time. Remember, the anti-Jewish immigration acts were still pretty well enforced. And then if we fast forward to August of 2017, when all of us were alive and conscious and forming memories and paying attention, hopefully paying some attention to the world around you. I know you are, just making a joke. You have this alt-right rally. Now, not every member of the alt-right were carrying Nazi flags like these guys were. Plenty of them were just, more part of this conservative movement, and they were not happy to see actual Nazis show up to this Charlottesville, Virginia rally. There's pictures of them marching through the streets of the city with tiki torches, yelling Nazi slogans like blood and soil. In German, that's Blut und Ehre is like blood and honor. I don't know blood and soil in German. But they were yelling blood and soil, blood and honor. Jews will not replace us was a pretty common chant. And that's just when I say I'm against Nazism, that's what I'm against. I'm not just calling people I disagree with politically Nazis. I'm calling... Hold on, I'm in the corner here. I'm calling guys with that flag Nazis, because they're carrying a Nazi flag. And a member of the alt-right who was later pretty well connected with the Nazi part of the people that came that day, drove his car through the crowd of anti-racist protesters, killing a woman named Heather Heyer, who was there to protest against people yelling Nazi slogans in her city. So, 2017, we had a Nazi murder somebody on American soil. This stuff matters. This stuff keeps coming up over and over and over again in history. Now, of course, the legacy of civil rights has just some phenomenal success following the just brutal backlash of the Red Summer and Tulsa. But as the decades come up, these people, these black people that are able to come up with the education of the Tuskegee Institute, of other black colleges and universities, and their own experiences, they're able to sort of get this new civil rights movement going in the late 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. Now, many of these civil rights leaders are assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Medgar Evers is assassinated. Malcolm X is assassinated. And that's just a small list of the people that were assassinated because of their belief in civil rights. Robert F. Kennedy. A lot of names on that list. And many hard-fought battles take us to 2019 and 2020. Sorry, I forgot to update the year on this one. Where things have gotten better. Things in 2020 are better than they were in 1920. We're just not there yet. We're not 100% of the way there yet. But we're always going to be trying to form that more perfect union. We're always going to be trying to fulfill Dr. King's dream and create the beloved community, right? It takes work, though. It takes dangerous work. So what I want you to think about, what I want you to take away from this, what did all of this mean to you? What sticks out? What are other ways you think the things we talked about today affect the modern world, right? because anytime we talk about stuff happening in history, you can trace echoes that eventually make it to the modern world, but like, this is the modern world. This is modern America. You know, at this point, all 4 of my grandparents are alive. Depending on how your generations work, your grandparents may have been alive by this point. At the very least, your great-grandparents, and some of you may have been lucky enough to know your great-grandparents. So, like, this is very recent. Keep that in mind. And have a great day. Remember, next time the video will be back at school with like a whiteboard and a green wall instead of whatever color that is. The end. Gotta learn how to gotta learn how to end these.